Hello and welcome back to a new Italian P&C video. Today we'll be doing something a bit different. We'll be talking about something that relates to a video that I made over 2.5 years ago. This video was called Who are the ancestors of the Europeans? This is the topic I'm very interested in a historical sense. And now, before you click off the video, because I know a lot of you aren't interested in the history of things, I will tell you this might interest you specifically as a person. Because there's a good chance that anybody that is watching this video comes from either Europe, or most of the times America, North America specifically, South America, or even Oceania. If that is the case, what I will be talking about in this video should interest you, because it is something that relates to your ancestors, even more than anything you've heard about before. You probably know your family's history, your close family's history, from where your people came from. If you're in the New World, probably somewhere in Europe. And even in Europe, you might ask yourself, well, my ancestors were probably like Germanic peoples, if you're like in the northern part of Europe, Slavic people, if they're in the eastern part of Europe, maybe Romans, if you're in the south, or ancient Greeks, who knows. But I have something that relates all these people together and many, many more. These are the Proto-Indo-Europeans, a people group so ancient that literally more than half of the landmass of today's world is inhabited by one of these groups that descend from them. So, if that has piqued your interest, keep listening, because there's a lot to talk about. So, this video specifically will talk about one thing. Well, I guess it's multiple things, but about one concept. The land of origin of these people. Where the common ancestor of the people of North America, South America, Europe, parts of Asia, parts of Oceania, all come from. And that is the concept of the Urheimat, also called the Homeland. And this is not only an ethnic homeland, it is also a linguistic homeland, because one thing that links all these people together is their language. There's a lot of the world's languages that have a common origin. And this common origin is because of this single people group that existed so far back in time in one specific area. So now you'll probably be asking yourself, if you're anything like me, what is this area you're referring to? Well, that's the question we will try to answer today, because it is a complex question to ask yourself, and there's many answers and hypotheses that people throughout history have given. So before we start with all the hypotheses, which will be the core of the video, let's answer ourselves to what actually Urheimat means. So, Urheimat is a foreign word. It of course comes from German. It is a mix of the German Ur, which means original, and Heimat, which means home. In the context of the Indo-Europeans, the Urheimat is the homeland or birthing place of a proto-language. A proto-language is the language that is the origin of other languages that exist in the future from that language. So it is the area where the proto-language was spoken before it diversified, and divided into the many evolved languages spoken even today. And this is the concept of the Urheimat, which, yes, it is also, as we will see, something genetic, more ethnic, but it is at its core something that has to do with linguistic and the origins of languages, because languages are, in some sort of sense, the soul of the people that live through them. Anything you do is probably something that you can trace back to what you speak like. And in the case of the Urheimat, that also has to do with what your surroundings are. If you live in a forest, you'll probably have a lot of words that refer to things you see in a forest. If you live in a desert, probably not a lot of words when it comes to trees or species of animals, you know? If you live near the coast, the same will do with sea life and jagged coastlines and all that kind of sort of stuff. But if you live very far from the sea, it's harder for you to actually come up with words that have to do with something you've never seen. So that's kind of the basis on how you can actually figure out where people live or where people lived without knowing, by looking at the language they were speaking. Also, one thing, Proto-Indo-Europeans. You've heard that word, but you might not know what that means. So that proto part, that P-R-O-T-O, is a word that comes from Greek, ancient Greek, and means first. It comes from the word protos, which is just that plus an S. And in this context, it means the last common ancestor of a group of languages, and it is found about through the comparative method. So what is the comparative method? Well, the comparative method is the strategy linguists use to recognize a modern language's roots. And if you use multiple languages together and you compare them one to another and they all have words that are similar or that have a common root, then you can figure out if they are related, or if the words that are similar together are just a coincidence or, more often, something imported from another language. Let's do a simple example. There are words in languages outside of English which have taken words from English because an invention made in an English-speaking country has not been translated. For example, computer. Computer in most of the world is still called computer. There are exceptions, of course, but most of the times it's still called computer. If you look at that, you can figure out that it's not a word that was made by that language, it's just taken from another language. In the case of the comparative method, when it comes to an extinct language like Proto-Indo-European, well, you basically have to do that with a lot of languages. People in the past started figuring out that there were a lot of languages that were linked together. An example was made by the 17th century when more European travelers were going to India, were going to Persia and the places in Southern Asia, and they were finding out that their ancient languages like Sanskrit, or in their case Persian when it comes to Persia, had similarities to the languages spoken in Europe. And then they found out that those similarities also were related to other languages that were in the eastern part of Europe, like the Slavic languages. And then those similarities were compared to the ones in Southern Europe, Northern Europe, and other parts of the world, and through a series of comparative methods, you can actually find out that they're all related together. So that poses the question, how are they related together? Well, now we know the answer, but in those times it was just kind of like, how is this happening? Like, how is this possible for people so far apart, Europe, South Asia, North America, Australia, to all have languages that are kind of related? So people started making theories about what that could mean. Of course, there were the biblical theories, you know, the kind of like everybody spoke the same language when humanity was created, so it's natural for the languages to be similar together. But then it would not really explain how there are so many languages that seem completely unrelated to any other language. Like, for example, in Europe there's this language, Basque, in southern France and north Spain. In that area, that language is spoken, but it's not related to any other language anywhere near it. It's like literally just a single language that has no correlation with any other language, and that kind of like completely destroys the theory that it has to do with like ancient humans, like ancient pre-diversifying of humanity, because then you wouldn't really explain how that is completely singled out in a continent where most languages are related to each other. So let's see where these languages and these people originated from. There's many hypotheses on where the original language came from. But we can make, as we said before, a connection between the early Proto-Indo-Europeans and the language they spoke to figure out their surroundings and what their society was like. So let's see some of the words that these Indo-Europeans, Proto-Indo-Europeans, were using. They had words for house, it was dom. They had words for wheel, hueculos. They had words for yoke, Yugom. They had words for cow, guos. They had words for ox, uxne. They had words for farm, ferkve. They had words for wheat, white. They had words for milk, melg. They even had words for horse, equos. Woman, gwen. Meat, mednu. So all these things we know through the comparative method, they had access to and they knew. So what does that teach us? Well, the word for house explains that they had, access to houses. They made houses, they built houses, they did not live in huts, and they did not live in caves. The word for yoke explains that they were domesticating animals. They had words for milk, so we know they were not lactose intolerant, or at least they know how to use milk. Then, what about farming? Well, they had words for farm, for wheat, for meat. Why does that matter? Well, that means they could get drunk. That means they knew how to use alcohol. They knew how to brew, which is pretty important as a society. They also had words for wheel or woman, which also explained that their societies were technologically advanced for the time, and they had names for types of people, genders, and so on and so forth. So all these words kind of explain how they lived, and something interesting is that they also explain how they lived in their society when it comes to the relation between people, genders, animals, and so on and so forth. For example, they had words for husband's mother, husband's father, and husband's brother, but they didn't have words for wife's mother, wife's father, and wife's brother. Which means that most probably their society was very patriarchal and was ruled by men. And this can be corroborated by the fact that most societies that are thought to descend from Proto-Indo-Europeans are, in the most case, historically patriarchal, historically led by men, although that of course has changed with time. All of this to say that through this comparative method, we can actually figure out exactly where they were located, and using archaeological evidence and genetic studies, we can at least try to understand where their homeland was. Now, let's get to the actual hypothesis on the origins of the Indo-Europeans. Let's see the many hypotheses on the Urheimat. First, let's start with the most, I would say, accepted hypothesis. There will be a lot of them in this video, so if the start is maybe the one that most people agree upon, don't worry, we will get to the more interesting ones later. The first one is the steppe hypothesis, also called the Pontic-Caspian steppe hypothesis. Why? Because this hypothesis states that the Proto-Indo-Europeans originated from an area that is on the northern shores of the Pontic and Caspian seas, Pontic of course referring to the Black Sea. So between basically the border between Europe and Asia. This theory states that through a succession of migrations from 4000 BC to 2000 BC, these groups would extend from this Pontic-Caspian steppe and reach many parts of the modern world. This theory was supported by Maria Gimbutas. She was a Lithuanian anthropologist and archaeologist. This theory, specifically the Kurgan hypothesis, was supported by Maria Gimbutas. What are the kurgans? Well, kurgans are burial mounds that were constructed over graves filled with one human and its goods. These were classic of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, and they spread from this area to Europe and parts of Asia by the 3rd millennium BC. According to Maria, the nomads from eastern Ukraine and southern Russia were the ancestors of the Indo-Europeans, and they went on horseback expansion through military invasion against the people, the native people of both Europe and Asia. The people they fought, which Maria calls the people of the old Europe culture, were Neolithic farmers. Maria thinks that gender is a key to understanding the conflict between the Proto-Indo-Europeans and the original inhabitants of Europe and Asia. According to her, the Proto-Indo-Europeans were paternalistic, patriarchal, and men-dominated, while the people from the old Europe culture lived in longhouses, were mostly led by women, if not at least were equal in signs of gender, and were usually in matriarchal societies. This part of the theory of the Pontic steppe hypothesis is not agreed upon by many people. In fact, this is less supported by the American archaeologist J.P. Mallory, which thinks that it was less about gender and it wasn't as violent as Maria thinks. In fact, Mallory believes that this expansion was mostly peaceful, more like a migration than an actual invasion. Another proponent of the Pontic-Caspian steppe theory is David Anthony, which is another American anthropologist. He is fixated on a specific part of the history of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the Yamnaya culture. The Yamnaya culture was a culture that existed in the areas of modern-day Ukraine and Russia for over 700 years, from 3300 BC all the way to 2600 BC. It was ruled by a series of chiefdoms, and also the genetical ancestry found in most modern Europeans, as well as Americans, Australians, and also in big parts of Asia, is related to the one of the Yamnaya people. He thinks that the Yamnaya culture, when they migrated in modern-day Romania and Bulgaria, was succeeded by the Cucuteni-Tripilian culture, which is regarded by another anthropologist of Finnish origin, Asko Parpola, as the culture which invented the wheeled vehicle, and a culture which lasted almost 2000 years until the end of the 4th millennium BCE. So, those are kind of like the lines of thought that stem from this Pontic-Caspian theory, but this hypothesis has a genetic basis in the study of haplogroups, especially haplogroups R1a, 1a, which was found in ancient DNA starting from the Pontic steppe all the way in Western Central Asia and Central Europe. Although all of this supports this as the main hypothesis, or at least as the most reputable of the ones for the Urheimat of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, this theory loses sustenance when the question of why so little genetic similarity between Central Europeans and Proto-Greeks is brought up. In fact, although the Proto-Greeks, which originally were called Mycenaean Greeks, but even before were just people in the Balkan Peninsula, spoke an Indo-European language, their genetic makeup is almost known when it comes to the descent of the Yamnaya people or in general Pontic steppe ancestry. These less believable parts in the steppe nomad theory gave rise to other hypotheses, the first of which is the Anatolian hypothesis. In 1987, an opponent of the steppe hypothesis called Colin Renfrew spread a new theory on the birthplace of the Europeans and many similar peoples. His idea was that the creation and spread of farming was linked to the spread of Indo-European peoples, and that the origin of the Proto-Indo-Europeans was not in Europe but instead in Asia, in the Anatolian Peninsula, also called modern-day Turkey. Farming, which was invented during the 7th millennium BCE, spread during a long time period, all the way through the rest of Europe and Asia. But for a certain amount of time, it was only in the Levant and nearby areas, so in this part of Western Asia. This hypothesis not only states that Anatolia is the birthplace of the ancestors of the Europeans, but that the spread of farming from the Middle East outwards coincided with a large movement of people and the spread of language groups. To this theory, native Indian languages of the Dravidian family, as well as Afroasiatic languages like Arabic, Hebrew, or Aramaic, and of course Indo-European languages, all descend from this region, and with them came farming. In Renfrew's words, the pre-Proto-Indo-Europeans spread from Anatolia westwards and northwards into Europe, creating the first Proto-Indo-European cultures in the Balkans and the Danube River Valley by the half of the 7th millennia before Christ. So, according to the Anatolian hypothesis, the origins of the Proto-Europeans is way older than the one of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. In fact, according to this hypothesis, the Old Europe culture, aka the European cultures before the spread of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, were mistaken by Maria Gimbutas as something separate from the Proto-Indo-Europeans, while instead they were just an archaic form of this new coming culture, which brought with them farming and their languages. The DNA studies previously mentioned during the Pontic steppe hypothesis go against Renfrew's theory, to the point where sources say he himself has changed his mind and now follows the Pontic steppe hypothesis as well. The next theory we will look at is the Caucasian or Iranian hypothesis. The DNA research conducted in the recent years has brought to light again a theory originally proposed when the idea of world races was introduced, that the once colloquially referred to as white people originated from the Caucasus Mountains, on the border between Europe and Asia. The research showed that the ancient inhabitants of the European steppe shared large parts of their genetic heritage with Caucasus hunter-gatherers. This theory supports the Indo-Hittite theory as well, which says that the ancestor language of Anatolian and Indo-European languages split into these two branches over 5,000 years ago. This is technically the theory that the American government nowadays still supports, as they categorize white people as Caucasians. The DNA research conducted on the remains of the Anatolian people of the time shows a lot of Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, but no Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry, which is usually related to the steppe nomads living in the Pontic-Caspian steppe. There's even those, like Lazaris and other researchers, Lazaris being one of these anthropologists, that believe in a Southern Arc hypothesis, that argues northern Mesopotamia, western Iran, and the southern Caucasus as the origin of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, due to these genetic connections. There's also other hypotheses on where the Indo-Europeans came from, and where their language developed, but they are considered fringe theories by the historical community. Yet, on this channel, that's what we do, explore and explain the mysterious and uncertain, so it would be a disservice not to give a fair chance to the other theories. These are the Indo-European origin fringe theories. There's three main theories considered outlandish by most researchers, and they all have to do with a fundamental change in what is expected when it comes to the region or genetic history of their ancestors. First of all, we have the Hyperborea hypothesis. Popularized by Russian nationalists during the early Soviet Union, but agreed upon by many politically extremist ethnologue movements in the early 20th century, this theory states that the homeland of the ancestors of the Indo-Europeans was Hyperborea, the so-called land beyond the northern winds. Depending on the specific supporter of this theory, this faraway land could either be a clearly located area in the north of Russia, in the Ural Mountains, or in the northern tip of Scandinavia, but to other more esoteric proponents, it could be a sunken or disappeared landmass in the North Pole. To even more extreme esoteric proponents of the theory, this landmass, this original homeland of the Indo-Europeans, could only be accessed by someone with an Aryan soul, which is a whole other deal that, relates to that specific group of people and that specific part of history. If the landmass was in the North Pole, as shown in medieval maps, this would explain, to the proponents of this theory, the light pigmentation of the skin of Europeans and their immediate neighbors as a way to camouflage in the snow of the Arctic. This hypothesis was influenced by the Indian nationalist Gangadhar Tilak's book called The Arctic Home in the Vedas. This links up to the next hypothesis, the Out of India hypothesis. Also referred to as the indigenous Aryans theory, this hypothesis plays on an idea rooted in Indian nationalism and Hindu tradition, that the religious and cultural legacy of India is not linked to a foreign invader, which is instead the case in most other Indo-European origin story hypotheses, but instead is native to the Indian subcontinent, inverting the Indo-European theory and proposing that these ancient peoples developed in India itself, as did their language, and from there spread out in a multi-millennia long span of invasions and Indian conquests. Finally, we have the continuity theory by Mario Alinei. This theory, possibly the most genetically different from the other hypotheses, suggests that the Proto-Indo-European language can be traced back to the Paleolithic, over 10,000 years ago, and the theory bases itself on the fact that to the eyes of their proponents, the genetic and archaeological evidence is not enough to prove that the mass movement and migration of people during the times of the hypothesized Proto-Indo-European migrations. So, according to the continuity theory, the Indo-European natives of the Ice Age are direct ancestors to the people that live there today, and not only them, but the people that live in the places which have European descendants or Indo-European descendants. So all of South Asia, big parts of Central Asia, as well as all of Europe, most of the Americas, and even parts of Oceania, including of course Australia and New Zealand. These were all the theories that have to do with the origin of the Indo-European people, the original homeland of these people and of their language. So now I hope I answered the question asked at the start of the video. Where do your ancestors, in the case that you are one of the descendants of these people, actually come from? Which hypothesis do you think is more valid? What of these theories do you actually believe in? I'm quite curious to see what other people believe. I honestly am always been interested in the Yamnaya one, the one that proposed both by the Pontic steppe theory, but specifically the one that looks at the Yamnaya people. But I'm curious to see what my subscribers and whoever finds this video thinks. Maybe you have other theories, maybe you have something else. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this type of content that I try to bring, that is a bit less map-based and more history-based. And if you did enjoy that, then I hope you subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and you like the video. So I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.